In recent years, tariffs have returned to the center of political debate. Suddenly, something that once sounded old-fashioned, almost 19th century, became modern again. Factories, trade wars, economic nationalism, protectionism. And for many people, the argument seemed simple. One side declared, tariffs are economic ignorance. The other declared, tariffs are patriotic. But historically, the question was never that simple. Because not all tariffs serve the same purpose, and not all tariffs produce the same effects. There is a difference between strategic protectionism and simply raising prices through broad import taxes. And once that distinction disappears, economic policy can become less about strengthening national production and more about burdening consumers while calling it nationalism. Historically, protective tariffs were tied to a broader vision of national development. In the United States, this became associated with what was called the American system. There is also an important historical detail that modern discussions of tariffs often forget. In the 19th century, the federal government was far smaller than it is today. There was no permanent federal income tax, no massive administrative state, no modern welfare system, no enormous federal bureaucracy requiring endless streams of revenue, which meant tariffs served not only as protectionist policy, but also as one of the primary sources of federal income itself. And within the older American system, this was not viewed as contradictory. The tariff revenue helped fund internal improvements, infrastructure, and national development, canals, railroads, roads, industrial expansion. In other words, the tariff system was tied to a broader economic vision. It was not merely tax imports, it was protect industry, generate revenue, and reinvest that revenue into national productive growth. But that historical context matters, because modern America already possesses a massive taxation system: income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate taxes, debt financing, which means modern tariffs do not operate within the same fiscal environment that existed in the age of Henry Clay or William McKinley. And once that distinction is forgotten, people can begin comparing very different economic systems as though they were identical. Figures like Henry Clay argued that a nation should not become dependent upon foreign powers for its industrial base. The goal was not merely to tax imports, the goal was to develop domestic productive capacity, factories, infrastructure, manufacturing, internal improvements. Protectionism, at least in theory, was supposed to nurture national industry, and later, figures like William McKinley continued this logic. The argument was that American workers should not be forced to compete directly against vastly cheaper foreign labor, without any protection at all. Whether one agrees entirely or not, there was at least a coherent industrial philosophy behind it. Tariffs were not viewed as an isolated policy. They were part of a larger economic strategy, but over time, much of that older logic was forgotten. Modern tariff debates often collapse into slogans: tariffs are always good, or tariffs are always bad. But reality is more complicated than that, because tariffs are ultimately taxes, specifically taxes on imports. And whether those tariffs actually function as protectionism depends heavily on what is being taxed. This distinction matters enormously, because a tariff placed on something the nation already produces abundantly functions very differently from a tariff placed on something the nation still heavily depends on importing. Imagine two situations. In the first, the country already produces nearly all the cotton it needs. Domestic farms exist, domestic supply exists, the infrastructure already exists. In that case, a tariff on foreign cotton primarily protects domestic producers from being undercut by cheaper outside competition. Consumers may still experience some price increases. Protectionism is never entirely free. But because domestic supply already exists, the economic disruption may remain limited. Now compare that to a product the nation still heavily depends on importing. Suppose the country only produces a small fraction of the sugar it consumes. People still need sugar. Businesses still need sugar. Manufacturers still need sugar. And so if large tariffs are suddenly imposed on imported sugar, the dependence itself does not disappear. The imports still arrive, only now they cost more. Which means the tariff begins functioning less like strategic protectionism and more like a broad indirect tax on the population itself. And this is where many criticisms of Trump's tariff policies emerged. Not because tariffs themselves are inherently irrational, but because many of the tariffs were applied broadly, including to goods, materials, and industrial inputs that American industries still depend on. Steel is one example often discussed. Tariffs on foreign steel can help domestic steel producers, but steel is also used by countless downstream industries: automobiles, construction, machinery, appliances. So while one sector benefits, another sector may experience rising costs, and those costs eventually move outward through the economy. This is one reason why tariffs can produce conflicting effects simultaneously. Policy may help one industry while harming another. Which means the real question is not simply, are tariffs good? The real question is, what exactly are they protecting, and at what cost? There is also another dimension that older protectionists understood more clearly. Protectionism only truly works if domestic production either already exists or can realistically be developed. Otherwise, a nation is attempting to shield industries that are not actually capable of replacing the imports. And in those cases, the burden falls heavily upon consumers, because tariffs cannot magically create productive capacity overnight. Factories take time, supply chains take time, skilled labor takes time. Industrial development is not instantaneous. And historically, many successful industrial policies were paired with long-term planning, infrastructure, investment, and strategic coordination, not merely tariffs in isolation. Now, to be fair, some defenders of Trump's tariffs would argue that temporary pain is sometimes necessary to rebuild domestic industry, and there is logic to that argument. A nation that loses too much manufacturing capacity can become dangerously dependent upon foreign powers, especially rivals like China. Recent global disruptions have made many countries realize how fragile supply chains can become, so the desire for greater self-sufficiency is not irrational. The deeper issue is whether tariff policy is being applied strategically or reactively, whether it is guided by industrial logic or political impulse. And this is where modern debates often become frustratingly shallow, because complex economic questions are reduced to tribal identity. One side says, free trade solves everything. The other says, tariffs solve everything. But history rarely works through absolutes. Even many classical economists who favored free trade recognized exceptions for strategic industries, national defense, or temporary industrial development. And many historical protectionists understood that indiscriminate tariffs could become economically destructive. The real question has always been one of prudence, judgment, discrimination, not ideology alone. What struck me thinking through this subject is how easily economic policy can become symbolic, a slogan, a posture, a performance of strength, but real industrial policy is far more difficult than that, because a nation is not strengthened simply by imposing costs. It is strengthened by increasing productive capacity, by developing industries, by creating competence, by building resilience, and that requires more than reaction. It requires strategy. The forgotten logic of older protectionism was not merely tax foreign goods. It was develop national industry carefully enough that dependence itself decreases over time. That distinction matters, because without it, tariffs risk becoming less a tool of national development and more a form of economic self-harm disguised as patriotism. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson here. Economic nationalism, without prudence, can become just as simplistic as blind faith in global markets. Both can become ideological abstractions. Both can ignore the concrete realities of production, labor, industry, and dependency. And once policy becomes detached from those realities, nations can begin making decisions based more on political emotion than on economic wisdom. The question is not whether tariffs are universally good or bad. The real question is, under what conditions do they actually strengthen the productive life of a nation? And under what conditions do they merely transfer costs onto the public while promising renewal that never arrives? Because ultimately, a strong economy is not created through slogans. It is created through competence, production, and long-term vision. And those things cannot be replaced by simply declaring economic war on the rest of the world. I'll see you in the next episode.